Hi, this is Jeff Blauette, technical agronomist with Cooperative Farmers Elevator, and on this week's Field Friday segment, I kind of wanted to bring you up to speed on what we're seeing out in the cornfields now, where we're at stage-wise, and what we can learn. As I get out and look at some of these cornfields now, we're past pollination, we're in that, early to mid-grain fill now. We can learn about kind of what we're maybe going to have for yield potential. We all know a lot of the area has been really dry. Some areas have picked up some rain recently, but we've been pretty dry this last part of the summer. And it's going to have some impact on some of the areas especially. The biggest things that we worry about is what's pollination going to do? Are we going to have, pollination have success? There are going to be some issues potentially with some hybrids and some timings depending on when they pollinated. I got a couple of ears that we have pictures of to kind of show you what you might end up seeing in some of this instance where we didn't have pollination success very well. There's gaps towards the base of the ear, and there's a few spots in the ear that the kernels didn't pollinate. Yes, it is true the kernels around those, if it's just a single or a kernel or two that didn't pollinate, the kernels around it will expand and get bigger in those areas. But you're still going to be lacking some, and especially when you start seeing areas like the base of those ears, that's going to have a negative impact on yield. If you see a lot of issues around the base of the ear, that usually ends up being a problem with ear droppage as well, because if it didn't pollinate around the base of that ear very well, a lot of times the ear shank development is not correct either, and that causes ear droppage problems towards harvest. The next thing is we did have some fields, and there's going to be areas of field, there's certain hybrids that pollinated fine, but then in the early grain fill we had some of that hot, dry weather that was pretty stressful. You can see some tip back on the ears where you can see the kernels pollinated on the tip, but some of those are shriveled up. That usually happens the first 10 days to 2 weeks after pollination, where those plants basically decide how many kernels they think they can sustain, and if it's less than pollinated, it'll abort some on the tip. You can kind of see maybe 5 to 10 kernels on the ears I have pictures of. In some cases it could be worse, but yeah, you could lose 100 kernels on an ear, and obviously that's real yield. The next thing you want to kind of be aware of as you're out, now that this weather's cooled down in the mornings a little bit, it's a lot nicer to go out in the fields. And we've had just enough rain in some instances to at least wash the pollen off the field, so they're not so messy to walk around in. But looking at the plant health, what are we seeing for diseases? What are we seeing for, probably the main thing is that you want to see right now is a nutrient deficiency, especially nitrogen. Nitrogen deficiency now, when that grain still has some fill to do, if that continues, you're going to have some stock quality issues potentially this fall. Nitrogen is always in that center of the leaf, the deficiency, and it's always worse towards the bottom. That plant will cannibalize the nitrogen out of those lower leaves if it needs to. When it's dry, you don't get as much nutrient uptake from the roots because a plant can't take nutrients out of really dry soil, so that becomes the thing it can do, is it can pull it out of the plant itself. I've got an example of what that looks like. The center of the leaf is kind of browned up or cannibalized. Probably done with potassium uptake, but if potassium deficiency symptoms are there, that probably happened earlier. That's the outer edges of the leaf that are yellow, not the center. So just be aware of what you're looking at. It might give you an indication of some stock quality issues later. You'll want to revisit those. If you see a fair amount of nitrogen deficiency, especially as it gets up towards the ear, at this stage we've got a lot of grain fill to happen yet. We probably want to keep an eye on those later to see how much more that progresses, because that plant's probably going to cannibalize the nutrients out of the stalk even beyond the leaves, and that'll cause some concerns later. So but kind of wanted to bring you up to speed of what we're seeing, with this weather we've had. We've had a lot of heat, a lot of dry weather. We could see that has some ramifications in our corn. So with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.